What happens when a country that just declared total control over the world's busiest oil route wakes up to find its entire coastline burning? Iran said the Strait of Hormuz belonged to them. 12 hours later, the United States Navy proved otherwise. Before we go any further, do one thing for me. Hit that like button the way a destroyer hits a launch command, fast and without hesitation. Subscribe if you want to be here for every strike, every twist, and every secret this story is about to reveal. And send this video to one person who still thinks a handful of trucks and missiles can shut down the most important waterway on Earth. Now let's get into it. The Strait of Hormuz is barely 40 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. You could almost throw a stone from one side to the other on a clear day. But through that narrow gap passes nearly a fifth of all the oil the entire planet consumes. Supertankers line up here every single day, moving crude from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself toward hungry markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. Whoever controls this strait does not just control shipping lanes. They control the heartbeat of the global economy. For decades, Iran has treated this water as its own backyard. Its coastline hugs the northern edge of the strait, dotted with hidden coves, rocky islands, and quiet fishing villages that double as launch points for something far more dangerous than boats. Tehran has spent years building a web of coastal missile batteries, fast attack craft, and underground bunkers along this exact stretch of water. The goal was never really about defense. It was about leverage. If Iran ever wanted to hurt the world economy without firing a single shot at another nation's soil, all it had to do was squeeze this one narrow channel. And that is exactly what happened. Iranian state television aired a broadcast that shocked even seasoned analysts. Standing in front of a wall of missiles, a senior commander announced that Iran now held total control over the Strait of Hormuz. He claimed that no vessel, military or civilian, could cross without Tehran's permission. He called it a new era of Iranian dominance over international waters. Within hours, tankers began slowing down. Insurance companies started raising premiums. Oil prices twitched upward on trading floors from London to Tokyo. For a moment, it looked like Iran's gamble was working. But bravado is not the same thing as power, and the United States Navy was about to teach a very old lesson in a very modern way. For weeks before that broadcast, tension had been building along these waters like pressure inside a sealed container. Iranian fast boats had been buzzing commercial tankers, cutting dangerously close to their bows. Drones had been spotted circling American warships, testing how close they could get before someone reacted. Small skirmishes had already flared near the coast, brief exchanges that ended almost as quickly as they began, but each one added another crack to an already fragile peace. Analysts who study this region kept saying the same thing. This was not a question of if a real confrontation would happen. It was a question of when. This was not the first time these waters had seen this kind of tension. Back in the late 1980s, during what history now calls the Tanker War, Iran and Iraq spent years attacking merchant ships passing through this exact strait, dragging outside navies into a conflict that had nothing to do with them at first. The United States eventually stepped in then too, escorting tankers and clashing directly with Iranian forces on more than one occasion. Anyone who studies this region carefully knows that Hormuz has never truly been calm. It has only ever been quiet between storms, and in more recent years that quiet grew thinner and thinner. A high-altitude American surveillance drone was shot down over these waters years before this crisis, a loss that cost more than $100 million and became, for a while, the most expensive drone ever lost in American history. Iran celebrated that moment as proof it could reach out and touch even the most advanced technology flying above its coastline. It was a warning shot that most of the world simply forgot to take seriously. The moment Iran declared total control, it crossed a line that could not be ignored. This was not just a provocation. It was a direct challenge to freedom of navigation, a principle that dozens of nations, including the United States, have promised to protect for decades. Within the Pentagon, the response was immediate. A carrier strike group already operating nearby shifted its posture. Destroyers moved into position. Reconnaissance aircraft that had been quietly watching the coastline for days suddenly had a very clear mission. What most people do not understand is how differently these two militaries actually operate. Iran's coastal defense relies on speed, concealment, and surprise. Small missile batteries hide under camouflage netting in the hills. Fast boats dart between islands. The entire strategy depends on staying hidden long enough to strike first and disappear before anyone can respond. It is a strategy built for a weaker force trying to punch above its weight, and for years, it worked well enough to keep bigger powers cautious. The United States Navy plays an entirely different game. It does not rely on hiding. It relies on seeing everything, moving faster than the enemy can react, and overwhelming any target the moment a decision is made. High-altitude surveillance drones can watch an entire coastline for more than a full day without ever needing to land. They notice things human eyes would miss, tiny changes in a tree line, a gap between vehicles that should not be there, a truck that was not parked in that spot yesterday. Once a target is confirmed, the response does not take hours, it takes minutes. That is exactly what happened next. American destroyers positioned southeast of the strait began launching cruise missiles toward confirmed coastal targets. These are not simple rockets, fired blindly into the dark. Each missile follows a carefully planned route, checking its position against the terrain below and adjusting itself along the way. They can be redirected mid-flight if new information comes in, which means even after launch, commanders still have control over where the weapon actually lands. It is less like firing an arrow and more like sending a driver who can change destination the moment better information arrives. Picture the scene for a moment from the perspective of a single missile crew tucked into the hills above the coastline. They had trained for this moment for years, running drills, memorizing firing solutions, waiting for the day their government finally gave the order to prove Iran's strength on the world stage. When the order came, there was probably a rush of pride in that bunker, a sense that history was being written in real time. What they could not have known, standing behind their launchers in the fading evening light, was that they had already been found. Persistent surveillance had been quietly mapping their positions for days, watching patterns, noting which trucks moved where and when. Confidence and awareness are not the same thing, and in this case, one side had far more of the second than the first ever imagined. Within the first hour, several Iranian coastal missile sites along the southern coast were struck. Explosions lit up the hillsides that had spent years hiding launchers under netting and rock cover. Reload stockpiles caught fire and began detonating on their own, turning what should have been a fortified position into a chain reaction of destruction. Local witnesses in nearby towns described the ground shaking, windows rattling from shock waves that rolled across the water from the impact sites. Iran did not sit back and take this without response. Coastal batteries scrambled to fire back. Anti-ship missiles were launched toward American vessels operating in the strait. For a brief moment, it looked like this could spiral into something far larger and far bloodier than anyone wanted. But this is where decades of investment in defensive technology proved its worth. American warships carry layered defense systems designed specifically to intercept incoming threats before they ever get close. Radar systems track incoming missiles from the moment they leave the launcher, calculating trajectory, speed, and impact point in fractions of a second. Interceptor missiles are fired to meet the threat mid-air, destroying it long before it reaches its target. Every single missile Iran fired at American ships that day was intercepted or missed its mark. Not one hit landed. Meanwhile, American strikes continued hitting their targets with brutal precision. It became painfully clear within the first few hours that this was not going to be a fair fight. It was never designed to be one. Out on the water itself, tanker crews caught in the middle of all this had a very different kind of fear to deal with. These are civilian sailors, men and women simply doing their jobs, moving fuel that keeps factories running and homes heated on the other side of the planet. None of them signed up to sail through a war zone. Captains on several vessels reported cutting engines and holding position the moment the first explosions lit up the coastline, unsure whether to push forward, reverse course, or simply wait out the chaos in open water. For hours, radio channels used by commercial shipping crackled with confused chatter, captains trying to figure out which lanes were safe and which had become no-go zones without warning. This is the part of modern conflict that rarely makes it into military briefings, the quiet terror of ordinary people caught between two much larger forces who are not actually fighting over them at all, but around them. If you're enjoying this breakdown so far, do me a quick favor and tap that subscribe button right now. Think of it as reinforcements arriving at exactly the right moment in the story. And if you have a theory about how this conflict escalates from here, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of you have predicted things before they happened in past videos. Let's keep going. By the second day, Iran's coastal defense network was in serious trouble. Their strategy had always depended on staying hidden and mobile, moving launchers from location to location so satellites and drones could never pin down a permanent target. For years, this worked because reconnaissance was slower than the enemy's ability to relocate. A photograph taken in the morning would already be outdated by the time analysts finished studying it, and by then the trucks would be somewhere else entirely. But persistent surveillance changed everything. Instead of relying on a single photograph taken once a day, American drones now maintained a constant watch over the coastline, circling for more than 24 hours at a stretch. This meant the gap between seeing a target and striking it shrank from hours down to minutes. Iranian crews would move their launchers into what they believed was a safe hiding spot, only to discover that safety no longer existed. The old rules of hide and seek simply did not apply anymore. There is something almost tragic about watching a modern military try to use tactics built for a different era. Concealment worked beautifully against satellites that passed overhead once or twice a day. It worked against reconnaissance planes that had to fly in, take pictures, and fly back out. It does not work against an aircraft that never leaves, that watches every hour of daylight and darkness with the same patient, unblinking focus. Iran's commanders were essentially playing a game of chess against an opponent who could see every move on the board, while their own pieces remained blind to the wider picture. One particularly costly moment came when a battery of Iran's most advanced homegrown air defense system managed to shoot down an incoming cruise missile over open water. For a brief moment, it looked like a genuine victory, proof that Iranian technology could still compete. But that victory came at an enormous cost. To achieve that single successful intercept, the radar system had to keep transmitting continuously for well over a minute, which is an eternity in modern warfare. The constant signal was like a lighthouse announcing exactly where the system was hiding. While the crew celebrated their success, a second cruise missile approaching from a completely different direction, one nobody had prepared for, arrived and destroyed the radar system entirely. One triumph immediately followed by total blindness. Word of that exchange spread quickly among Iranian commanders still holding position along the coast, and it forced an impossible choice: stay silent and useless, or transmit and risk destruction. Some batteries chose silence, going completely dark, refusing to power up their radars even when new targets appeared on the horizon. It was the only rational choice left, but it also meant those units contributed nothing to the fight for the rest of the day. A weapon that cannot safely turn itself on is barely a weapon at all. It becomes expensive scenery, sitting in the hills, waiting for an order that never comes, because giving that order means volunteering for destruction. This single exchange captures the entire story of this conflict in miniature. Iran occasionally proved it could compete on a technical level. Its engineers built real, functioning weapons capable of hitting fast-moving targets. But proving you can win one battle means nothing if you cannot survive the next 5 minutes. Modern warfare punishes hesitation and rewards depth, layers of capability that can absorb losses and keep functioning. Iran had pockets of impressive technology scattered across a coastline it could not fully protect. The United States had an entire system built to make sure no single loss ever mattered much. By the third day, oil tankers that had been frozen in place, too afraid to move through waters where missiles were flying, slowly began resuming their journeys. Shipping companies watched closely, waiting for confirmation that the strait was actually safe again before risking billion-dollar vessels and the lives of their crews. Insurance premiums, which had spiked the moment Iran made its declaration, started coming back down as it became obvious who actually controlled these waters. Financial markets told their own version of this story, one written in numbers instead of headlines. In the hours right after Iran's declaration, oil futures jumped sharply as traders priced in the risk of a genuinely closed strait. Analysts on business news channels spent that first day throwing around worst-case scenarios, warning of fuel shortages and price spikes that could ripple through economies thousands of miles away from the Persian Gulf. But markets are ruthless calculators of reality, and reality was moving fast. As word spread that American strikes were systematically dismantling Iran's coastal missile network, that same oil price began drifting back down, first slowly, then quickly, almost as if traders themselves were watching a scoreboard update in real time. By the time tankers resumed their normal schedules, prices had settled close to where they started, as though the entire crisis had simply been erased from the ledger. This is the part of the story people often miss when they only watch the explosions and the missile trails. The real battle in the Strait of Hormuz was never just about weapons. It was about a claim. Iran said the waterway belonged to them. Every tanker that resumed its normal route, every insurance company that lowered its rates back to normal, every oil trader who stopped panicking, was a quiet rejection of that claim. Power in the modern world is not just measured by how many missiles you can launch. It is measured by whether the rest of the world believes your threats matter. And within 72 hours, the world had its answer. Something else became painfully clear as this played out. Iran's declaration of total control was, in many ways, a bluff dressed up as strategy. It relied on the assumption that the mere threat of closing the strait would be enough to force concessions, that no nation would actually risk direct confrontation over open water thousands of miles from home. This assumption has worked before in history. Smaller powers have used the threat of chaos to extract concessions from larger ones simply because the larger power did not want the cost or the headlines that come with a real fight. But bluffs only work if nobody calls them. And this time, someone did. It is worth remembering that Iran is not a weak country by any reasonable measure. It has one of the largest populations in the region, a genuine domestic weapons industry, and a military that has fought and adapted through decades of sanctions and isolation. None of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz should be read as proof that Iran cannot fight. It absolutely can, and it did, launching real missiles, scoring at least one real intercept, and forcing an opponent with vastly superior technology to take every single threat seriously. The story here is not about weakness. It is about the specific, brutal mathematics of trying to hold open water against a navy built from the ground up to dominate exactly this kind of fight. Different battles reward different strengths, and this particular stretch of ocean rewarded persistence, surveillance, and networked precision over raw courage and improvisation. Let us pause here for one more moment. If this story is genuinely pulling you in, hit like right now, not later. right now before you forget. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to understand what is happening in this part of the world. And if you have not subscribed yet, what exactly are you waiting for? We are just getting to the most important part. Step back for a second and think about what actually changed between the moment that broadcast aired and the moment tankers started moving again. On paper, nothing about the geography changed. The strait is still 40 kilometers wide. The oil still flows through the same narrow gap it always has. Iran still has a coastline, still has trucks, still has engineers capable of building missiles. And yet everything that mattered had shifted completely. Confidence had shifted. Perception had shifted. The entire idea of who actually controls this water had been tested in the most direct way possible, and the answer left very little room for argument. Geography rarely changes overnight. Power, and the belief in that power, can change in a single afternoon. There is a deeper lesson buried inside everything that happened in those 72 hours, one that goes far beyond missiles and radar systems. Modern military power is not just about who has bigger weapons. It is about who can see clearly, decide quickly, and adapt without hesitation. Iran's forces were brave. Nobody watching this conflict could deny that individual crews stood their ground under fire, launched what they had, and in at least one case, scored a genuine, difficult intercept against a fast-moving target. Courage was never the missing ingredient. What was missing was depth. A single successful intercept does not matter if the system behind it cannot survive the next 60 seconds. A hidden missile battery does not matter if the enemy can watch your exact coordinates change in real time. A bold declaration on state television does not matter if within 3 days the entire claim collapses under the weight of reality. This is the uncomfortable truth about modern conflict. Bravery and even genuine skill are not enough on their own. You need systems that support each other, technology that talks to technology, and enough redundancy that losing one piece does not mean losing everything. Think about how differently these two forces treated the concept of a mistake. On the Iranian side, a single missed intercept or a single moment of exposed radar could mean the loss of an entire battery, an outcome with no easy recovery. There simply was not enough depth behind the front line to absorb repeated losses. On the American side, a missed shot or a failed intercept was almost a non-event, quietly logged, quietly corrected, with 3 more assets already moving into position to cover the gap. This difference is not really about bravery or national character at all. It comes down to decades of budget decisions, industrial capacity, and strategic choices made long before this specific week ever began. You cannot build that kind of depth overnight, no matter how determined you are or how many missiles you manage to hide in the hills. The United States Navy did not win this confrontation because every single missile it fired was perfect, or because every sailor involved was somehow superhuman. It won because the entire system was built to absorb mistakes, adapt to new information within minutes, and keep pressure on the enemy without ever needing to pause and regroup. When one missile missed, 3 more were already in the air. When one radar system went quiet, a drone circling overhead had already spotted the next target. This is what decades of investment in persistent surveillance, networked weapons, and layered defense actually buys a military. Not perfection, but resilience. For Iran, the lessons from these 72 hours will likely shape military planning for years to come. Concealment alone is no longer enough when the enemy can watch a coastline continuously instead of glancing at it once a day. Mobility helps, but only if you can move faster than your opponent can process new information, and right now that gap has closed dramatically. The old playbook of hit, hide, and wait no longer guarantees survival the way it once did. Other nations watching from a distance took careful notes of their own. Gulf states that rely on this same waterway for their own exports quietly welcomed the outcome, even if none of them said so loudly on camera. A closed or contested strait would have hurt their economies just as badly as anyone else's. Further away, military planners in countries with their own coastal defense ambitions studied the footage and the aftermath with a much colder, more analytical eye, less interested in who won and far more interested in exactly how the winning happened. Every lesson learned along that coastline about persistent surveillance, about the fragility of radar silence, about the cost of concealment in an age where nothing stays hidden for long, became a data point that will quietly influence military spending decisions in capitals most people never think about. For the rest of the world, this moment became a reminder of just how fragile global stability can feel, and also how quickly a serious threat to that stability can be answered when a determined power decides to respond. Oil markets stabilized. Shipping routes reopened. Within a week, headlines about the Strait of Hormuz began fading from the front page, replaced by whatever crisis came next. But for the people who study military history, this confrontation will be studied for a long time. It became a clear, almost textbook example of what happens when overwhelming claims meet overwhelming capability, and the capability wins every single time. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we close this story out. Iran's commander stood in front of cameras and used the words total control. It is worth asking what those words actually meant to the people who said them. Perhaps it was genuine confidence, a belief that decades of preparation had finally created a force capable of matching a superpower. Perhaps it was theater, a message meant more for domestic audiences than for the ships actually crossing those waters. Either way, the gap between the words spoken on television and the reality that played out over open water could not have been wider. Somewhere in a briefing room, someone will eventually write the official report on these 72 hours, full of technical charts and careful language designed to avoid embarrassing anyone too directly. But the real report was already written by the tankers that resumed sailing, by the oil prices that quietly returned to normal, and by the silence that settled over a coastline that once claimed to control the entire strait. Reports get filed away. Results speak for themselves. Total control lasted less than half a day before the first missile ever launched. By the time the smoke cleared along that coastline, the phrase had become less of a declaration and more of a warning, though not the kind anyone in Tehran intended. It became a warning about what happens when confidence outpaces capability, when a claim gets made before the ability to back it up has actually been earned. There is a strange kind of silence that settles over a battlefield once the shooting actually stops, a silence very different from the quiet that came before. Before the first missile ever launched, the silence along that Iranian coastline was full of tension, full of anticipation, crews checking equipment, commanders waiting for orders, everyone sensing that something enormous was about to happen. The silence that came after was different. It was the silence of wreckage, of burned-out launchers cooling in the evening air, of radios that no longer had anyone left to answer them. Two silences, separated by 72 hours, and in between them, an entire claim of dominance rose and fell. Power, real power, is quiet most of the time. It does not need to announce itself on state television because everyone watching already understands the stakes. The United States Navy did not need a press conference to prove what it could do in the Strait of Hormuz. It simply did it, methodically, precisely, and without hesitation, while the rest of the world watched oil prices and insurance rates tell the real story. Sometimes, the loudest declaration in the room is not the one that wins. It is the one that gets answered. And that is exactly what happened here. A claim of total control met an answer measured in minutes, not months, and the gap between the two told the whole story better than any commander ever could on camera. The coastline that was supposed to prove Iranian dominance instead became a case study in what happens when bravado runs into readiness. The strait remained open, the tankers kept moving, and somewhere along that battered coastline, the silence after the last explosion said more than any broadcast ever could. If this story taught you something new today, make sure you are subscribed before you go, because there is more of this coming, and you do not want to miss the next chapter. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.